The history of our people has always been one of movement and exploration. After almost 3,000 years of being confined to the lands between the Pontic Steppe and the British Isles, Indo European peoples would begin their next conquest, venturing into the unknown of North America. Just as those who hailed from the Yamnaya and corded ware, the peoples of the New World were many. These people were prone to migration, establishing powerful chiefdoms and tribes wherever they chose to strike their camps and set their corn. In the southeast, encompassing in what is today's Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Mississippi, and beyond, lay the vast territory of the Muskogean people. Starting from the pre Columbian times all the way to the 19th century, we will be discussing the rise and fall of this unique people and the ones who have left their name behind in the places and landmarks across our great state. Alrighty, Hinsiki, Estonko, how are you doing
Hello,
tonight, Shackpole?
hello.
Well, I was trying to read some Creek right there, or Muskogean, whichever you prefer. And I'm not really a master at it, though. I know that preparing for this series, you've been doing some research, and you seem to have a better grasp of the language than I do.
Well, I've done a little piddling, studying the language, studying the linguistics. Can't say I speak it by any means, but yeah.
Alrighty. Well, so we're here in this series about the Creek War. We've been planning this for almost a year now, and when we begin any kind of venture discussing an event or whatever it may be, we have to go and discuss the origins. And so, in order to discuss the Creek War, to discuss Andrew Jackson, the Red Sticks, the White Sticks, all that good stuff, we have to start at the very beginning. And to start at the very beginning, what's the origin of the Muskogean people?
Well, I think the best way to understand the Muskogean grouping is to examine the language family. The Creeks were not really a singular group of people until historical times, but there was a wide diversity of uh, Muskogean and Muskogean adjacent groups that were scattered throughout the southeast. So the language family is divided into a western and an eastern branch. The western branch consists of Choctaw and Chickasaw. These were people who inhabited what is now Mississippi, parts of western Tennessee, northern Alabama, and various other locations. They moved around a lot. There was Choctaw as far east as Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. And then the eastern group, which is contains the language spoken by the Creeks, uh, includes Muskogean and Hitchiti. Hitchiti is the language spoken in southwestern Georgia, what is now southwestern Georgia, and three more minor languages: Alabama, Coasati, and Appalachee. Appalachee is the language spoken by the chiefdoms of the Floridian Peninsula, um, particularly the area around Tallahassee. And Coasati is the language of Muskogean peoples in what is now northern Georgia and northeastern Alabama. The Alabama language was centered around the Alabama River, what is today the Montgomery area. Um, the Muskogean language family is kind of isolated from anything else on the continent, and it's not really clear what it's related to, but it's clear that it's been around for thousands of years uh, independently. Um, I think the estimated divergence between Western and Eastern Muskogean is about 3,000 years ago. And the fact that it's so isolated kind of obscures any effort to tie it towards any other groups. For that reason, it's not really clear where the Muskogean peoples came from. but we know that their languages have been here for thousands of years. Um,
Now, I've heard some conspiracy things state that it's either related to or it's Mayan. What are some words you have to say on that regarding that?
I have not found any good evidence that ties it to the Mayan languages, but there's speculation that there was contact between Mayans and Muskogean peoples through trade. And I don't really have much more to say on it than that. There's not really any solid evidence that ties the Mayan languages to the Muskogean languages. There's more evidence for indirect contact through trade, but not much evidence for any kind of cultural continuity between the two. That doesn't rule out the possibility that Mayan settlers did arrive in Muskogean lands, but we just don't have very good evidence for it.
Interesting, interesting. And that's something we'll probably never really know the answer to. I mean, we are, dealing with pre-Columbian times, but something I find a lot in this whole, discussion or anything concerning this is we have that term Muskogee and we have that term Creek. Do you have any idea where this Appalachian Creek, not Appalachian, but Appalachian Creek comes from?
Yeah.
What it means?
The word Creek is an exonym which was coined by whites, and it does not originate from the Creeks themselves, as far as I can tell. The fact that Creeks settle almost exclusively in river valleys and along creeks. I mean, every village that I've been able to, that I've read about, they're all placed on creeks, especially at the confluences of creeks. And that makes sense because this is a agricultural society which relies on maize cultivation, and you need, wide, flat, fertile bottomlands for that. So that's where the word creek comes from. As for Muskogee, I do not recall the exact etymological origin of that, and it's actually debated. I don't think there is a consensus on where that word comes from. It comes from within the Muskogean language, but as to what it means, I've heard that it means mixed people, but that is not something that I'm sure about. That's just a theory.
Interesting. Now, I know a lot of this stuff we've been talking about, the origins and like pre-Columbian history of them, but what was their society like in those in between years from their origin leading up to European contact?
Well, whenever you're talking about Native American groups, you have to reconstruct everything from archaeological clues. There's virtually no written history and very little oral history to go off of. But in the centuries leading up to European contact, we'll start around the ninth century. That's when very clearly organized, stratified chiefdoms began to appear in what is now the southeastern United States. And the evidence points to the arrival of corn as the reason for that. Corn first appears in the archaeological record in the southeast around the 2nd century AD. But at first it was not very widely adopted, and at that time the southeastern peoples were already agricultural. They had developed their own agricultural package of native crops known as the Eastern Agricultural Complex. This included squash, sunflowers, and various oil seeds, which are now no longer cultivated. Sunkweed, knotweed, and goosefoot. So corn arrives around the 2nd century AD, perhaps a little earlier in some places, later in others. But it doesn't really revolutionize the indigenous societies. until around the 8th century, when it starts to
Really
become,
dominate.
yeah, it starts to become a larger part of the diet, and this coincides with the a large growth in population and stratification.
Interesting. And I don't want to take you on a. I don't want to throw too many hypotheticals out there. But are you aware of any? I've heard you also talk about um, that Neolithic peoples of Europe that were not Indo-European, the people that built Stonehenge, those are the Middle Eastern farmers, that their diets and their health was not as good as those of steppe steppe ancestry, Indo-European ancestry. Is it the same in North America when corn arrives? Do you know if there's anything that where
Yes,
maize ruins like the health of people, where it lessens the healthiness of the population?
that does seem to be the case. By the time of Moundville, um, the diet of the natives was overwhelmingly based on maize. Isotopic analyses of the bones there indicate that it was a very large part of the diet. The consumption of protein was perhaps lower than in the days of hunting and gathering, and the people's health suffered for it. I think the average the average life expectancy at Moundville seems to have been about 30, and there's almost no remains of people beyond the age of 50. Those account for only 5% of burials.
That's insane.
The life expectancy was short, and the diet was based overwhelmingly on grain. Um, there was dental problems once you get into your 20s and 30s, pretty severe dental problems, and the main sources of protein would have come from fishing. There was a fishing weirs would be constructed on creeks and rivers, and fishing would be a group activity where like a large number of people would stomp down the creek, drive fish into these weirs, which would funnel them into nets, and so they could catch large quantities of protein that way. They also used poisons pretty extensively to induce massive die-offs. So they would dump a bucket of poison upstream, say, and it could kill hundreds or thousands of fish at a time. Another primary source of meat was actually not directly hunting itself, but hunting pests, which would be attracted by the vast agricultural fields in the area. So things like raccoons, possums, squirrels, those would be killed incidentally while doing agricultural labor.
Because I know we've had private discussions in the past about Native American diets, and it's not exactly always white-tailed deer and corn that we always imagine.
No.
That a lot of it would have been kind of what we would deem as weird or unconventional food.
Oh yeah,
like possum.
Yeah, frogs, toads, dogs, turtles. Turtles were actually very widely consumed. A very important part of.
What about turkey? I know there turkeys were domesticated in Central America and in Mexico.
No,
So
studies have been done on turkey remains from southeastern villages, and there's no evidence for any kind of domestication process. There is evidence that young turkeys may be caught and raised to keep a ready supply of meat around. There's one village that is mentioned in the De Soto Chronicles where, when the Spanish came through, they had dozens and dozens of turkeys already prepared and ready to be eaten. But as far as the archaeological record goes, there's no evidence of any domestication of any animals besides dogs.
Isn't there a some kind of more conspiratorial evidence, at least in written evidence, that there was a village somewhere in the Carolinas where they farmed deer?
Yeah, I believe it was called Duhar or Duhari on the South Carolina coast. And early Spanish records do mention that there was a population of deer that was kept in a central corral in the village, and was they were milked. So these deer would be released during the day, and they would forage in the fields around the village, and they'd be herded back up at night and milked. That is a practice which has no archaeological evidence to sustain it, but I think it's mentioned in several sources, and it also forms the basis for a theory of Celtic or Irish settlers intermixing with the Native Americans in that region.
Yeah, I think a theme as we progress down this series that we're going to learn is that there is a connection between Celtic peoples breeding and intermingling with Native Americans. Not so much in a conspiratorial sense, but in a quite literal sense of when Anglo settlers start coming in to the New World. And as always, it seems like when these Germanic peoples are coming into the New World, that it's for some reason it's the Celts that are almost leading the vanguard on the outskirts. Plunging the frontier. Not always the case, but it seems like there's a disproportionate amount of Scots and Scotch Irish people, which that's problematic in a genetic sense because most Scotch Irish people are not Irish; they're almost Northern English, really, a lot of them. And you might only have like a generation or two living in Ireland, but I don't want to get into that, and I don't want to ruffle the Gaelic feathers out there about that. Sorry, Celts, but yeah. But anyway, let's move into some real confirmed history and get in. So, what are the principal towns of these Muskogean people, and when? What are the, at least in the eyes of the Europeans, like the first European contact? I guess that'd be DeSoto. So, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of run us through that?
Yeah, that's correct. The first contact with the interior peoples came with the DeSoto expedition. There had been some contact on the coast. Most Muskogean groups do not live on the coast. There was some evidence that there were some in coastal Georgia and South Carolina. But at the time of European contact, the primary three, I guess you would say, polities of Muskogean peoples would have been Kofitacheki, which is not actually confirmed to be Muskogean, but the linguistic evidence strongly suggests that it is. Kofitacheki was located in what is now the South Carolina Piedmont. Then you have the Coosa chiefdom, which was certainly the largest and most powerful Muskogean chiefdom, stretching all the way from what is now northeastern Tennessee all the way down to the coastal plain of Alabama, centered along the Tennessee and the Coosa rivers. The center of power in the Coosa chiefdom was in northwestern Georgia, and that's where the capital was located. And then you have Tuscaloosa's chiefdom, which I don't know if it has a proper name, but Tuscaloosa's chiefdom was located on the coastal plain along the Alabama River in what is now Alabama. You had many more minor chiefdoms, such as Okuti, located in central Georgia along the Ocmulgee River, if I'm not mistaken. And the Proto-Appalachee would have been around at that time, located in the Florida Panhandle, and they were a Muskogean group as well. There were various other Muskogean groups further west in Mississippi, but the most powerful were located further east.
Now, I've always picked your brain about the Appalachia. I'm not referring to the ones in Florida. To address the elephant in the room that we've been preparing about. Where does the kingdom of Appalachia stand in that power ranking with Kolfedecheki and Tuscaloosa's kingdom, if we can call them kingdoms, really, or even like the Coosa? Well, can you talk a little bit about Appalachia?
So Appalachia is simply another word, if I'm not mistaken, for the Coosa chiefdom. Appalachia is located in northern Georgia. It's poorly attested by more mainstream accepted historical records like the DeSoto expedition and the Pardo expedition. But there is considerable evidence that northern Georgia remained a relatively very powerful chiefdom all the way up until the end of the 17th century. The most widely cited account describing Appalachia was written by a certain Richard Brigstock. I don't recall exactly how he ended up there, supposedly, but it describes a kingdom made up of 7 provinces with a very centralized government and very politically advanced and developed government. Beyond the direct evidence, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for the existence of the Appalachian Kingdom, which comes from expeditions from Spanish missions on the coast, which were trying to recontact and reconnect with chiefdoms which DeSoto had encountered. The furthest they ever got was central Georgia because they were stopped by the local chiefdoms there, warning them not to venture any further into the interior because of roving bands of Europeans on horseback who killed any Spanish that came into sight. So, according to Brigstock's narrative and other narratives, Appalachia sort of served as a haven for misfits and outcast survivors of European expeditions who found their way there and were given haven and allowed to settle.
So that's
There were supposedly Protestant missionaries who set up shop in Appalachia and converted the elite to French Calvinism. And
see, that's the little bit I know of Appalachia, and I guess it's a good thing we're getting some of these hypotheticals or quasi historical things out of the way before we discuss the real history. So it kind of, for our viewers, that they get the idea of these more mythical places, and then when the actual history is discussed, they can kind of line it up and see if they want to believe in it or not. I am under the impression that the first European, if we're going to follow this line right of the Kingdom of Appalachia in northern Georgia, around I think the Helen area, is where some people have said that they think it was that or north of Atlanta somewhere, like around
yes,
maybe like
the metro Atlanta area in northeastern and northwestern Georgia.
So one of the first things I've heard about is that, and a lot of people don't know this, they talk about that St. Augustine was the first permanent settlement of Europeans in the New World. That is correct, but it wasn't St. Augustine first. It was called Fort Caroline, and it was established by the French. Now, the thing about Fort Caroline is that Fort Caroline was, it was a, real legitimate, government sanctioned French venture expedition from my understanding. It was a French national, colonization project. But from my understanding, the majority of the French that were there were Huguenots, were Protestant. And I believe during that time in the 1500s, leading up to, what would be the 30 Years' War, France was undergoing the wars of religion. Now, I could be wrong on that. The wars of religion could have been post 30 Years War, leading up to the reign of Louis the 14th, or really I know they ended with one of the Henrys who said something about like things like Paris was worth a mass is what he said when he converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. But the point is that France during the 15 and 1600s had a lot of Protestants, and that's something that's not talked about a lot. And that a lot of those Protestants, were having trouble in like the Spanish Bros, but the most Catholic of the Catholic nations is France. Okay, we can leave that there. I mean, that's where St. Louis is from. Okay, so we're not going to sit there and pretend, oh, based Catholic Spain. No, it's France. Go back home, Hispano Bros. The Franks are talking. So anyway, off that rant. So these Huguenots have this settlement at Fort Caroline, and these dirty Spaniards, because they have the impetus to think that they can go against the crown of Charlemagne. They attack Fort Caroline and they basically massacre everybody there. And if I'm correct on the source, and I don't remember what the source's name was, I think it was actually a Spaniard, but 6 of these Huguenots somehow survived, and they basically just made a book for it through the woods, the about said the jungle. And then I remember that Florida, and all that's not exactly a jungle. But the point is that they make a run for it, and somehow they end up in northern Georgia, and they're settled in the Kingdom of Appalachia, and that these men were given prominent positions in the I guess you'd say the government of the kingdom. And then about 20 to 30 years later is when Roanoke, I could be wrong on that date, but when Roanoke is established, and there's the whole mysterious disappearance of Roanoke, that some of these people, like I believe they say the Dare girl, I don't remember her name is Elizabeth or not, but the one they go on that's like the baby, that there's an account that basically states that she ended up marrying one of these like powerful chieftains in Appalachia, I believe. And I think some of the sources of that state that they were brought there or encouraged to come there by these Huguenots, who obviously would have been, firm allies with the English, despite, the Saxon and the Frank, having warred with each other for, 115 years plus in Europe.
I'm not aware of that specific narrative, but it is claimed that English did end up in the area from the Virginia colony, actually, not the Roanoke colony. But
Oh, really?
I haven't heard about the claims surrounding Roanoke. But yes, some ended up leaving, supposedly leaving the Jamestown area and ended up there. The Appalachian chief allowed a limited amount of Europeans to settle, but he distributed them out among the villages, so there couldn't be a core of Europeans existing in any area. Not so that no power base could form. Essentially, they would be distributed throughout the villages, and they would be required to marry native wives, according to the account. But I mean, the accounts that I've read seem to me to be pretty dubious. There's a lot in them that makes sense given what we know from other records, and then there's some linguistic things that just don't make any sense at all. So I say anything about the Appalachian Kingdom from the Brigstock narrative, I would take with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and I'm just saying these things just to promote, a sense of interest in the audience, because these are things that, like I said, that I found interesting, because really at the end of the day, it destroys and breaks down the whole narrative that pretty much before Europeans arrived, Native Americans were running around in loincloths with bows, just hunting deer, which is, cool and all, but it's not really the truth. Now, to get to the real history, can you lay out the DeSoto expedition. Who is Hernando de Soto, first off, and basically what did he do when he came here?
So De Soto, if I'm not mistaken, was the governor of Cuba, and his journey through the southeast, if I remember correctly, was designed to find an overland route from North America to Mexico. The De Soto expedition started out on the west coast of Florida, and in that region there was no Muskogean people, but he encountered all kinds of Timucuan and Calusa people groups. His first encounter with Muskogeans comes in the region of what is now Tallahassee. I think within the city of Tallahassee actually was where the capital of these Appalachie Creeks. There's different groups called Appalachie, and it's confusing. His expedition made camp in that chiefdom over the winter, I believe the winter of 1539, and then moved through central Georgia into South Carolina, which is where the first powerful chiefdom was encountered, the aforementioned Cofitachequi. The leader of Cofitachequi was a woman, at least the leader which was presented to the Spanish. She's known as the Lady of Cofitachequi, but there's some speculation that she was not a true ruler, and she was essentially a puppet which was put forward to distract and allow the actual holders of power to escape from De Soto's grasp. But at Cofitachequi, there was a large temple which was filled with all kinds of riches, so many pearls that the Spanish struggled to actually load them all up and carry them with them. A variety of garments made out of textiles and fur. It was a mortuary temple, so the bodies would be outfitted with all kinds of grave goods, which were plundered by the Spanish. They describe very intricately woven cane mats with designs, statuary carved out of cedar wood, which was claimed to rival the statuary of ancient Rome. I find that hard to believe, but that was what one of the accounts claimed. So after Cofitachequi is plundered, the De Soto expedition moves northwards through North Carolina. The next powerful chiefdom they come into contact with was Joara. Joara, I don't think is believed to be Muskogean, but there's speculation about that.
I've heard some people suggest that Joara was a Proto-Cherokee.
I don't believe it was. I think the most widely accepted theory is that it was some kind of Siouan group, but we really don't know for sure. It's not even clear that the Cherokee existed in the Southern Appalachians at that time. They could have, but it's not very clear. After crossing the Southern Appalachians during a very cold fall, I believe it was autumn, very cold, deep snow drifts, he entered into the northern outskirts of the Coosa chiefdom. I believe the first town that De Soto contacted, which was under Coosa's control, was Chiaja. Chiaja was a village located on an island in a river. We don't know exactly where it was located, but I think the consensus is that it was on the Little Tennessee River. And his encounter with Chiaja, I'm going to give it more importance than it probably deserves, because it's just like the prototypical example of how these encounters went, where De Soto shows up on the scene, gathers up the local elites, brings the interpreters that he brought along as slaves and lays down the law. Says, you're going to give me this, you're going to give me that, and woe be unto you if you don't. So he shows up. They take corn, they take slaves as porters, possibly as prostitutes as well. And every time he encounters a new village, he takes the leaders hostage until they safely transit out of their territory in order to deter any kind of attack from the local natives. So I'm going to read an excerpt from his encounter at Chiaja. So this is coming from the DeSoto Chronicles. On July 5th, the governor entered Chiaja. The cacique moved out of his houses in which he was lodging, and welcomed him very hospitably with the following words: "Powerful and excellent Lord, I consider myself so fortunate in that your lordship is pleased to use my services, that no greater happiness could come to me, nor any that I could esteem as much. Your lordship ordered me from Guajale to have maize for you in this town for 2 months. I have here for you 20 barbacoas, which is essentially a silo, full of choice maize, and the best that can be found in all the land. If your lordship was not received by me in accordance with what is due to so great a prince, have consideration for my few years which acquit me of guilt, and receive the good will which, with great, true, and sincere loyalty, I shall always have for what concerns your service." The governor answered him, saying that his service and offer pleased him greatly, and that he would always consider him a brother. In that town there was an abundance of butter in gourds, in melted form, like olive oil. They said that it was bear's grease. There was also found considerable walnut oil, which was like the butter. It was clean and of good taste, and a pot of bees' honey, which before nor after was not seen in all the land, neither honey nor bees. The town was isolated between 2 arms of a river, and was settled near one of them. At a distance of 2 crossbow shots above the town, the river divided into those 2 arms which were reunited a league below. The field between the one arm and the other was in places about the width of 1 crossbow shot, and in places of 2. They were of great width, and both were fordable. Very excellent fields lay along them, and many maize fields. Inasmuch as the Indians were in their town, only the governor was lodged in the houses of the cacique, which is the chief, and his men in the open field. Wherever there were any trees, each one took his own. In this way, the camp was established with some widely separated from the others, and without any order. The governor overlooked this, since the Indians were peaceable, and the weather was quiet, and the men would have suffered great discomfort if they had not done this. The horses reached there so weak that they were unable to carry their owners through their weakness, because of having come from Cofitacheki all the way with but little maize. The horses had suffered hunger and fatigue all the way from the unpopulated region of Okuti. Since most of the men were not fit to fight on them, even if it should be necessary, they put the horses out to pasture at night, a quarter of a league from the camp. The Christians were in great danger, for if at that time the Indians had attacked them, they were in a poor position for defending themselves. There the governor rested for 30 days, during which time the horses grew fat because of the luxuriance of the land. At the time of departure, because of the importunity of some who wished more than was proper, he asked the chief for 30 Indian women as slaves. The cacique answered that he would talk with his principal men. But one night, before returning an answer, all the Indians abandoned the town with their wives and children and went away. The next day, when the governor had made up his mind to go look for them, the cacique came, and on arriving spoke as follows to the governor: "Powerful Lord, I am ashamed and fearful of your lordship, because my Indians, against my will, decided to go away. I fled without your permission, and having perceived the mistake that I committed, I have come as a loyal vassal to deliver myself into your lordship's power, so that you may do what you please with my person. For my people do not obey me, nor do anything except what my uncle orders, who is governing these lands for me until I am of proper age. If your lordship wishes to follow them and execute on them that which they deserve, I will be your guide, for my fortune refuses at present to let me do more. The governor immediately went in search of the Indians with 30 horses and a like number of foot. Passing through some towns of the principal Indians who had gone off, he cut down and destroyed their fields, and went to hold the river above where the Indians were on an islet, whither the men of horse could not go. He sent word to them there by an Indian that they should return to their town and should have no fear, and that they should furnish him porters for carrying as had been done by all Indians before. That he did not wish any Indian women, since it cost them too dearly to give them to him. The Indians considered it well, and came to the governor and made their excuses to him. And so they all returned to the town. A cacique from a province called Accoste came there to visit the governor. After offering himself to him and exchanging words of politeness and courtesy with him, the governor asked him whether he knew of any rich land. He said that he did, that there was a province to the north called Chisca, and that there was a foundry for copper and other metal of that color, except that it was finer and of much more perfect color and better in appearance, and that they did not make so much use of it as it was softer. The same thing had been told to the governor in Cofitachequi, where he saw some copper hatchets, which they had said had a mixture of gold. However, the land was thinly populated as far as that region, and they said that there were mountain ridges which the horses could not cross. On that account, the governor did not wish to go thither by direct road from Cofitachequi, and thought that if he went through a populated region, while the men and horses were in better condition, and he more certain of the truth of what there was, he could turn hither through ridges and better populated land, where he could travel better. He sent 2 Christians from Chiaja with Indians who knew the land of Chisca and its language, in order that they may examine it, with orders that they should go to report what they found at that place, where he said he would await them. So that kind of exemplifies the prototypical relations between De Soto and the Indians. He shows up, expropriates food, porters, women, and tries to essentially reconnoiter what the mineral and metal resources in the area are. He typically meets little resistance, sometimes even obsequious obedience from the Indians, but oftentimes they will slip away in the dead of night or otherwise evade him.
Now,
And word travels quickly throughout the area that he's coming. So typically these people have warning of what's coming their way. And oftentimes later on, they will just abandon the region entirely before the expedition arrives and leave abandoned towns.
now I find that funny because in my study for this series, I've been reading Peter Cozen's "A Brutal Reckoning" about the Creek War, and it has a little bit discussing De Soto's expedition. And I believe it talks about in the Coosa Chiefdom that the slaves would have it's either their calf muscles or their hamstrings sliced, where they couldn't escape. So it's clear that this is a civilization that understands hierarchy, and it has a slave and master class. And it appears that it's not so much that they're like in this it just basically seems like they're kind of they understand the dynamic at play. They understand that De Soto is a more powerful regal entity than whatever they have, and they're at best they're willing to play into it, and at worst they're willing to feign deception so they can get the jump on them, which we'll see later at Mabilla. I find it interesting they talk about the horses, and I don't really think of North Georgia or the Carolinas being exactly rough country. I mean, a lot of the Anglo backwoodsmen were using horses, so I find it interesting that their horses, the Spanish, were having trouble, and it appears that they're talking about war horses. They're not talking about pack horses because he's talking about that they using them to fight. And I'm sure they had pack horses and mules and donkeys with them, being from Spain. But these war horses, these destriers of this time period, they're not small little horses. These are big horses. I mean, they call them chargers. If you want to find a breed that descends from that, a charger would be that. And these horses were, known to be aggressive. They were known to be strong, and they were essentially meant to carry a guy and, heavy, not heavy in the sense of like it adds the impact, but it was meant to carry a heavily armored and armed rider with a big long lance to just smash into a line. This is what the warfare in Europe was like at the time, or it was, coming from that time. This is entering the age of pike and shot, but heavy cavalry was, to play. And, these natives didn't have cavalry. They didn't obviously have, full steel plate armor that, the best of the conquistadors on these horses can afford. So I found that interesting that these horses that they have are probably horses that are, very well cared for, very well groomed, and, they're having to do the job of a palfrey, which is a riding horse, not so much of a war horse, which is meant, exclusively for battlefield employment. But I believe, they'll get their chance in Mabilla. So would you like to move on the expedition down into Alabama?
Sure. So after leaving Chiaja, they go sort of in a southwesterly direction through the mountains of eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina. They come into North Georgia, which is the seat of power of Coosa. I believe the chief of Coosa, if I'm remembering this correctly, claimed that he could summon as many as 6,000 warriors to be at his town within a few days. There was a prodigious population centered in North Georgia. It was very densely populated compared to the surrounding region. I believe there was a 3-day period hiking through, walking through the region around Coosa where the Spanish never lost sight of cultivated fields and farmsteads. So after leaving Coosa, he takes the chief of Coosa as a hostage, and they travel down the Coosa River through the area of what is now Rome, Georgia, enter into Alabama in what is now Cherokee County, and continue southwest, generally along the Coosa River, possibly venturing out a little bit into some of the creek valleys. And then he comes to the end of Coosa's dominion at around what is now Montgomery, at which point I believe the chief of Coosa either escaped or was released because he was no longer of any use as a hostage. And this is where DeSoto meets Tuscaloosa, which is probably the most famous Indian character to be remembered from his expedition. Really, the only one to be widely, popularly remembered, besides the Lady of Cofitachequi. But his encounter with Tuscaloosa, at this point, the Indians of the area kind of know what the game is. They know what has been going on in other provinces, destroyed agricultural fields, pilfered food stocks, slaves taken, the whole deal, and they decide they're not going to put up with it. So the Tuscaloosa's underlings prepare an ambush for him at a town called Mauvilla, which there's some speculation Mauvilla was not even a real town, that it was actually just a decoy set up as a trap, but we're not sure about that. Mauvilla was located on the coastal plain of Alabama, probably around the area of Wilcox County, if I'm not mistaken.
I've heard some people say that it was in Lowndes County.
It was in that general area. Yeah.
I believe that I don't know how true this is, but I believe either the University of Alabama or the University of Montevallo, but I think it was Alabama, found the site of the battle. I could be wrong on that, but there's some archaeological evidence indicating that they found the battle site.
So the expedition arrives at this fortified town, arrives at Mauvilla, and they are treated like it's a celebration. The Indians, they send out their dancers. They send out food. It's like they're preparing to, they're preparing to greet them, preparing to treat them, preparing to declare their obedience to the governor. And one of DeSoto's men peers into the doorway of one of these huts, and he finds a bunch of Indians wielding spears and bows and arrows, and that's how the attack starts. Is that the Indians' cover is blown, and thousands of these braves come out of these huts, and mayhem breaks loose, and large number of Spaniards are wounded in the initial foray, but they pull back outside of the palisade and light the town on fire, and break through the walls and wipe out. It's claimed by the chronicles as many as 3,000 Indians were killed at that one site. There weren't very many women or children around, which lends credence to the idea that this was just a decoy town set up purposely as a trap. I think it was also implied in the chronicles that it was suspiciously clean, and it looked like it was a new construction. So after the battle, 22 Spaniards are killed, including DeSoto's nephew. 148 are wounded, and a large number of horses are lost and wounded, and a very large amount of the expedition's provisions are lost as well.
I believe that casualty count to some degree, because as I was saying with these war horses, this is the time in Europe where the Middle Ages, what we would call the medieval period, and we're well into the Renaissance, but this is the time period of where armor is at its best. The weapons are at their best. So you can think of this period as being, somewhere stuck between the late Middle Ages, like the Wars of the Roses, for example, up until, like the Italian Wars. The Italian Wars are going on now. So, these Spaniards, they can be wearing anything from, chainmail, brigandines, gambesons, which are, wool jackets, wool tunics, that can protect against cuts, all the way up to full plate armor, variety of helmets, variety of weapons. They could be using anything from, regular arming swords. They could be using anything from long swords, pole axes, bill hooks, halberds, pikes, maces, war hammers, nasty stuff. And these natives, at best probably have, I imagine, stone spears, maybe some copper spears, copper axes, wooden clubs, I know that the War Club is the favorite of Eastern Woodland peoples, from my understanding. And that that will lend credence to the white stick and the red stick when we get into the war. But
The Indians were very competent with the bow and arrow. It was mentioned in the Chronicle that during the Battle of Mauvilla, there was an arrow which was shot, and its strength was so great that it went through the haft of the lance and didn't even leave a splinter. It just shot clean through it.
wow, I know that the Eastern Woodlands peoples were known to be good archers. I mean, I think it was in the Song of Hiawatha. It was said something to the effect if he could shoot 9 arrows, not something like 9 arrows in the sky and run and grab them when they fell down. He could do that like 9 times or something while sprinting, full sprint. So, and these aren't the longbows of Europe. These probably aren't like the 180-pound draw weight, you know, man killers of the European battlefield. These are composite bows. They probably don't do as much damage, but I mean, if I'm hearing the account of it can shoot through a lance shaft and basically punch through it like a bullet hole, or like a bullet, that probably means that these are serious weapons. And I've heard some accounts of, I believe, down in South America, that these Spaniards, they would come out of combat with the natives looking like porcupines, just shot all over with arrows.
It's noted in the account of the Battle of Mauvilla, 148 wounded, 688 arrows shot into them. So that I find that kind of funny.
Yeah, I imagine most of those wounds came from arrows to some degree. And
Yeah,
what I want to get at with the whole armor idea, and I'm trying to get this on a man for man understanding of, well, how could so many of these Spaniards kill these natives, but these natives couldn't kill them? And you have to understand, this is to the viewers, and you might understand this. The point is, with these weapons and armor of the Europeans versus the natives, is these Europeans have longer reaching weapons and they have better armor. So essentially what that means is that they have an easier time killing them. They have a better reach in a hand to hand to kill them. They, they have weapons that can get through the native armor, quite easier, versus the natives don't have as good of a reach on them, and they don't have as good as armor to stop themselves from being protected. And I watched some things about people that do historical reenactments or for things like the War of the Roses, and one of these guys talked about that he went to a reenactment and he fought in 100% steel plate Gothic plate armor, which is of German origin. Very likely that some of these men in Hernando de Soto's expedition could have been wearing this. It's possible. Um, I know there were some more Spanish centric armor designs, like the Morian helmet, that we think of conquistadors wearing, that they probably would have been wearing. But the point, this guy went to this reenactment and he said that he picked armor and he picked a long sword. And so he didn't have to use a shield or anything. He had the sword, and he said that he learned that in the fighting, even though this isn't, real combat per se, but he could literally just bust through a line of people, taking hits from halberds, taking hits from billhooks, uh, taking, pokes, things like that. And he was impervious to it. Well, he could sit there and just cut people down left and right. And so that's what I want people to understand, is that when these battles are going on, these well-armed Spaniards, on whether on horse or on foot, I mean, they can just sit there and dish out damage while just taking it up. I mean, they're tanks on foot and on horse. So it's not likely that all the Spaniards would have been at that level, but I mean that, and you want to combine genetic factors of these conquistadors are probably not the poorest of the poor of Europe. Some might want to argue that, but I mean these men are probably from a quasi knight background. I say that in the sense of, these men probably were born either, in the families of, fighting retainers for nobles, or they were, of, knightly background or knightly families to some extent. And you gotta think too, Spain is at this time is just getting out of the Reconquista, and it's going into, its Italian wars. So Spain is a very militant, country. It has desires to, conquer and fight. And so, these men are, the tip of the spear in regards to that. But anyway, getting off the sidetrack, I believe it's DeSoto after that. Doesn't he end up going out of Alabama?
Yeah, the expedition continues through what is now Mississippi, Western Tennessee, Arkansas. He dies at the Mississippi River. Uh, I'm really not that familiar with the western extent of his expedition. I mostly just studied up until the point of Mauvilla, because that's really the area I'm more interested in, is the Muskogean groups. Because once he gets out of Mississippi, it's no longer Muskogeans. We're talking about Siouan peoples and various other groups. So
Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about something that you told me, but I've also heard some different accounts of. And some people say that Chief Tuscaloosa was a giant. What's the rundown on that?
well, what I've read in the chronicles, it just mentions that he was of significant stature compared to the other Indians and compared to the Spanish. Doesn't really mean he was a giant. He could have been quite tall.
I
But
wa- I watched kind of a kooky history YouTube video one time about let's just say a certain group of people that more or less are the real people of all these different populations that have always been around. They were these people in this place and that place. I think you know what I'm referencing. And the guy was trying to argue that these people were the real Native Americans because supposedly Chief Tuscaloosa's son was named like Black Jaguar or something, and he was like 8 feet tall. I don't know how true that is, and
I'm not aware of any historical basis for that. I think the only records of Tuscaloosa's son, I think, come from the DeSoto Chronicles, and I don't think it even gives a name. It just mentions him as his son.
yeah, and I find that
It
the
mentions
name
his body was
Black,
recovered from the battlefield. Tuscaloosa's body was never recovered, so he may have escaped and not perished in the fighting.
and I find that problematic too. That whatever that source was, this was years ago, but that he said his son was named something Jaguar, because then that leads into the whole period of, okay, well, we're Jaguars in the Southeast at this time. And, I know you know a little bit about that. That's not, exactly pertinent to this discussion, but I find that almost like it's implying that yes, Jaguars were around at this time in the Southeast. But anyway, I know there were some other expeditions that came into Muskogean lands at this time. We had the well, you said the Pardo was more into non-Muskogean places, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, the Pardo expedition did go through Kofitacheki. It was trying to retrace DeSoto's route, and it went through North Carolina. Most of North Carolina was settled by Algonquin and Siouan groups, and the Pardo expedition did find Jawara, which was an important chiefdom that DeSoto had passed through, and the furthest that it ever got, I believe, was to Chiaha, which, if I remember correctly, had declined at that time. They may have gotten to Coosa. Actually, they did get to Coosa, or at least one branch of the expedition did get to Coosa, and it was either the incorrect site. It was not the same site as the Coosa of DeSoto's expedition, or the capital had just declined significantly because it was not what it had been in DeSoto's day.
Now, the reason there, I find the decline part kind of interesting because when I'm reading about the Tristan da Luna and his expedition, some of the stuff I've seen is that you go from it declined to it's abandoned, it's nobody's here. And I wonder if that speaks to, and I guess just to give reference to Tristan da Luna's expedition. So Tristan da Luna, he is related to Hernan Cortez, I believe, to some degree. Um, and basically, he is trying to go and also set up a expedition, but he's trying to make a overland route from Florida to St. Helena, which is in South Carolina. And so he lands in around I believe it's Pensacola. They were trying to find a outpost in Mobile Bay called Filipina Bay, but his fleet eventually chose this place called Ochuse Bay, which is in Pensacola. And then from there, they pretty much go up, they go up, like Alabama, they go up the southeast, and they come to some village at some point called Nani Pacana, and I believe that they find that there's not a lot of people there. Um, and I think that's kind of sort of what they really find is that there's not a lot of people. And then, apparently in my sources I read didn't really give me much reason why. And I wonder if it has to do with just that they weren't finding a lot of things.
If I recall,
They eventually ousted the Luna. He basically gets fired and he returns back to Mexico and dies, and the expedition's a failure.
if I recall, at that point, the game was well known between the Indians and the Spanish, and whenever news of a Spanish party came through, oftentimes Indians would just leave the village and move on to somewhere else so they wouldn't have to deal with it. These were, while these people were a settled sedentary society, they didn't tend to keep the same village sites for very long. They may set up a town and it may stay in the same spot for a few decades, and then oftentimes they would move on to another location.
Why do you think this is the case?
Well, primarily, it would have to do with warfare. Like they're just getting pushed out of this area due to conflict with a stronger tribe. They're just moving on somewhere else. There's also the fact that the agricultural fields would get worn out and they would just move on to more fertile territory. And also, this is in the day before, sanitary sewage systems. And so things, it was just junk and sewage would build up in the area and it would just not be a healthy place to live anymore. So they would move on to somewhere else.
Now, we've talked a little bit about it, and this probably should have been addressed earlier in the video, but do we have a idea of what Muskogee, like the social structure looks like of this period?
Yeah. So the Muskogee, like many other Native American groups, they had a matrilineal family structure of kinship. So you belonged to a clan or a moiety, and your membership in this clan was determined by your mother. So inheritance of status and position is passed from mother to son, and the maternal uncle and maternal grandfather play at least a co-equal role with fathering the children. The biological father actually does not play an important role oftentimes, and a son will be brought up by his mother's brother, typically. And this is a system that remains in place well into the historical period. There's a hierarchy among different clans, like the Creek, the Upper Creek of Alabama. At the time of the Creek War, I think they had about a dozen clans, but there had been many more in the past, as many as 30 or 40. And different clans were more highly esteemed and had higher status than others. Some clans had an ill repute, and some were more powerful. In historical times, the Wynn clan was the most powerful clan. Um, One can speculate about why that is. I don't think I've read a good explanation for how different clans got different statuses, but it probably would have to do with uh, their things that their ancestors had accomplished, or and such as that. So,
Well, I'd done some research a little bit into the religion, or at least the mythology of the Creek, which is we'll maybe save that for another video. But these the Wind Clan, from what the thing I watched was a video, it stated that basically when the giver of life, the master of life, when he like created man, there was something about all the peoples were blind, they could not see, and that when he in his mercy decided to give sight to people, the Wind Clan were like the first people he gave it to, and they were the furthest east. And that when they got their vision, they saw him, and they gave thanks to him and prayed to him, and that's why they're the most esteemed of these clans to some degree, if that makes sense.
so the leader of a creek village or chieftain would be known as the Miko. Um, the Miko did not typically rule as a despot. He was kind of bound by the council of elders, and chiefs could be deposed or replaced. And also, the position was not necessarily hereditary. A new chief could be elected after the old one died, which was not from the original chief's family. And there were lower magistrates. I think the word for them was henaha, but these were essentially traveling judges who would go around between villages and execute the law of the chiefdom. Um, there wasn't really a state structure by the historical period. Um, One can speculate as to whether there was ever a state structure. I would think the Kusa chiefdom probably would not qualify as a state, but power was relatively decentralized.
Hmm. And maybe that explains to another reason why they were so you know weak in putting up with this against the Spanish. It like you said, what I think it was the Kusa chief, he could summon like 6,000 warriors, but I mean, it doesn't seem like he has the same pull of a lord, with his vassals in Europe. It's almost like a more like he's trying to play like he can, like like it's a like he's being he has a lot of bravado, saying like, oh, I can do this, but maybe he tried to call up 6,000 of those warriors, and maybe their allegiance to their lord is not really that strong.
Yeah, the further out you get from the center of power, the more that the relationship seems to just be more of a tributary network where um, local leaders have to pay homage to the big man further away. By the time the DeSoto expedition gets out west to what is now Arkansas, the chiefdoms seem to be much more well organized and structured, and are able to put up a pretty stiff resistance. I
Hmm.
think it was Quapaw that had something like, I don't remember how many thousands, but it was thousands of warriors that were chasing the expedition in canoes down the river and lining up along the banks and shooting arrows at them to drive them out of the territory.
There's an account from the Amazon rainforest, and this is it's more pseudo history. We don't know how true this is. I don't remember the name of the account, but I believe the guy was a priest. But there was some kind of Spanish expedition to the Amazon, and when they went down there, they encountered all sorts of these civilizations. And now I'm saying this, number one, so you can go research this yourself, um, because it's interesting, and this is something that's recent. That's mainly the two means of why I'm bringing this up in relation. But I'll get to why. I guess I'll get to why there's a story out of that that reminds me of that. So number one, research it because it's new. Number two, research it because I'm bringing it up. You need to, see if my words are true on that. And then, number three, so when this expedition's going down the Amazon, they encounter all these civilizations. They talk about how there's these like grand royal roads that these vast native armies can travel down, and essentially these Spaniards pick a fight with all of them, and the whole expedition is pretty much them on a. It's like the scene from what's the book? What's the Heart of Darkness, where they're on the boat and they're fighting the natives, and it's pretty much like this multi-day multi-day scene of the Spaniards on this boat probably shooting guns and crossbows at natives that are shooting bows at them, natives that are out in war canoes trying to get to them. They're hacking them down with axes and swords as they climb up on this boat. And I think most of these Spaniards actually died on that expedition. I think the guy that claimed he wrote about it claimed he lost an eye. So it was serious. But that reminds me of the DeSoto expedition we were talking about.
Yeah, well, DeSoto lost more than an eye.
He lost his life, but
It was pretty rough going.
yeah. Well, I mean, these people were tough. They're tougher than us. Whether they're native or European, they were much stronger back then and could probably endure more, and they did. And a lot of people lived to tell the tale, and some didn't. But that's just the way the cookie crumbles, I guess, in those regards. Do you have anything else to say regarding, I would say, early Muskogean history?
Well, I'll cover a few more things. So I may have mentioned this earlier, but essentially the peak of Proto-Muskogean Mississippian civilization is around the 13th century. And at that point, it begins a moderate decline. Um, we don't know exactly why this decline happened. One theory is actually that the introduction of beans um, caused this disaggregation and uh, a loss of political capacity because it expanded the production capacity for food, and so that more outlying villages didn't necessarily need to rely on a centralized structure for growing and distributing grain. They became more self reliant and dependent, and this caused a decline in political complexity. There's also, I mean, I believe that the Mississippian decline roughly coincides with the Mayan decline, and there's some speculation that they were caused by the same climatic changes. So by the time that the Spanish do encounter the Proto-Muskogean people, it's a civilization that has declined. It wasn't any kind of catastrophic event, but this is just, it seems to have been just sort of a stepwise change in political organization that took centuries to play out. But the big ceremonial centers like Moundville had already been long abandoned by the time the DeSoto expedition arrived. Uh, they may have still been used for ceremonial purposes, but the larger cities that had sprung up were no more, and life had returned to more of a local chiefdom based system.
Interesting. Um, and then I know at the end of like the 1500s, beginning of the 1600s, I believe is when the Cherokee come on the scene in the Appalachian Highlands, and they start pushing down south. And I don't want to go into too much of that because that's going to be a main feature of next episode. Is the Creek and Cherokee wars that happen, and what that essentially does, and basically it sets up the events for the Creek War. It will set up, the world for it. Do you have anything further to add or comment to tonight's episode, Shaq Poll?
Uh, well, I reckon that'll do.
Alrighty. Well, if you live in Alabama or you live in Georgia, I'd encourage you that, listening to this episode, take that and apply it into your world. I mean, I think I was watching a documentary that talked about that they found a Spanish pike head out in Piedmont, Alabama. So, these things we're talking about, there's more to learn. There's more archaeological evidence can be dug up. I mean, there's like a place somewhere down in, I think near Wetumpka, called the King's Mound that I just heard about, like the last year or two. And, so this stuff is, they're always finding new stuff about this. And I imagine, 30 years down the road, we'll know more about these, early Muskogean, societies and peoples than what we did, now or before. So it's something that's always developing. So I would encourage all of you that are in the Southeast to not view Native Americans exactly as, dudes running around with stone bows and arrows, wearing loincloths, hunting deer, like I said. Now, these people were building things, they were building houses, and, obviously they were building something, and doing things worthy to be, remembered by the Spanish.
Well, certainly, these are societies that are far more advanced than we give them credit for. There are accounts of buildings that they built which were large enough to house 1,000 people comfortably. They were capable of a lot more than we imagine, and capable of making very fine trade goods. They had contacts all over the continent. Goods flowed from the upper Midwest to the South, and from the Gulf Coast to New England. Things were so much more interconnected and complicated than we realize. It's not as simple as red men living out in the woods, digging up roots and eating berries.
Yes. Alrighty. Well, that's all you have to add to this discussion tonight. I think we'll wrap it up with episode 1. It was a pleasure having you on here as always, Shaq Poll. And like I said, I know that you're I would consider you a Native American history aficionado, especially compared to me.
I don't know about that. I'm flattered, but well, thank you.
Oh no, you're good. We'll continue planning episode 2. But yeah, viewers, you can find me on Twitter at Otto Wilhelmsen. You can find me on Substack, I believe, under the same name. Let me check again to make sure, because I want to make sure I'm getting that right. Yes, sir, at ottohawker.substack.com. And it's under Wilhelm Substack. So that's where you find me at. I'll hopefully be getting into the writing again soon. I've been preoccupied with YouTube and Twitter and communicating with people and setting up other things. We have some great content coming out in 2025. You're going to see a lot of content spam here soon. I'll just put it that. So, again, thank you for coming on, Shaq Poll. I'm glad I could have you, man.
Take care, Otto.
And viewers, y'all take care. Have a good night, and we'll see you around.